the bells toll. The air is heavy. In the streets of medieval Europe, the Black Death moved like a shadow, unseen, unstoppable, and merciless. Whole families vanished overnight. Villages fell silent. Faith was shaken, and fear was the only law left standing. If history's darkest chapters keep you awake at night, leave a like to keep the fire burning, and subscribe to Nighttime Historian, where the past whispers in shadows. Tonight, we open the Black Death Chronicles. The night began not with thunder, nor with fire, but with a silence so deep that even the dogs ceased their barking. A thin veil of mist lay across the fields, clinging to hedgerows and creeping over the dirt paths where peasants dragged their weary feet. In that silence, a cough broke the air, harsh, ragged, filled with something unseen. Few marked it. Fewer still understood what it carried. But years later, when the world counted its dead and churches lay swollen with graves, some would remember. It began with a cough. It began with the breath of one unseen traveler. A ship had come to the port of Messina, black sails flapping like torn shrouds. Upon its deck, corpses lay swollen and still, their flesh darkened with strange marks that no priest could bless away. Rats scurried in the shadows, their eyes glittering as though they alone bore witness to the world's undoing. From that vessel the sickness walked ashore, unseen, unholy, as silent as fog and as certain as the grave. The bells of the churches rang that day, but not for triumph or feast, they tolled for warning, though no man yet heeded the sound. The chroniclers of the age would write of it later, with ink that seemed to drip like blood across the parchment. Anno Domini 1347, death entered Europe on wings of shadow. But to the poor farmer in the field, to the child clutching a mother's skirts, to the priest kneeling before his altar, it came with no heraldry of history. It came as hunger. It came as fear. It came as a sickness that could not be named. The first to fall were forgotten swiftly. A woman slumped over her spindle. A fisherman found floating in his own boat. A beggar coughing blood on the steps of the cathedral. People muttered that it was a punishment for sin, a curse from God for the pride of kings and the greed of lords. They whispered that the angels had abandoned mankind, leaving only demons to walk the earth. Yet others said it was the Jews who had poisoned the wells, or witches who stirred foul brews in the forest. In the terror of not knowing, men turned against one another, as though by spilling blood they might halt the spilling of their own. But the sickness cared nothing for prayer, nor rumor, nor vengeance. It moved with the swiftness of a hawk and the patience of creeping ivy. First the groin swelled, then the armpits. Black buboes blossomed like flowers of the grave. Fever burned. The body shuddered. Within days, sometimes hours, the skin darkened as though the flesh itself bore the stain of damnation. Few who were touched lived long enough to tell their tale. And those who did live carried fear in their eyes until the end of their days. A monk in Siena, his quill trembling, wrote, "So many have died that all believe it is the end of the world. Brother buries brother. The priest falls with his flock. No man dares look another in the eye, for who knows whose breath carries death? And though his ink dried centuries ago, one can almost hear his voice crack, the sound of a soul unmoored from all certainty. What was once the rhythm of life, the market's clamor, the ringing of blacksmiths' hammers, the laughter of children, began to falter. Bread went unbaked, fields unplowed. Streets filled not with the cries of merchants, but with the creak of carts bearing bodies to mass graves. The very air seemed tainted, heavy with the rot of flesh and the smoke of endless burning pyres. Some carried flowers, pressed to their noses, desperate to keep the stench, and perhaps the plague itself, at bay. Others locked themselves in their homes, believing that walls of stone could keep death from crossing their threshold. Yet still it came, seeping through cracks and keyholes, settling in the lungs, stealing warmth from the skin. And as death spread, so too did silence. In many villages, not even the bells rang, for there were no hands left to ring them. But in the midst of ruin, there were those who sought to understand. Physicians, draped in robes and leather masks, wandered the streets like carrion crows, their long beaks stuffed with herbs meant to ward off contagion. They pressed their fingers to swollen flesh, listened to rattling breaths, and bled their patients in hopes that death might be coaxed out drop by drop. Yet their knowledge was as ash in the wind. The sick died as swiftly under their hands as they did without them. For all their books and theories, they were but children striking stones together in a storm, blind to the lightning that split the sky. Still, life clung on, stubborn as weeds between the cobblestones. Mothers nursed their fevered children even as their own bodies trembled with sickness. Priests whispered last rites over heaps of the dying, their words dissolving in the air before they reached heaven. And in the fields, some bent their backs to the soil, planting seeds they might never live to reap, yet planting them all the same, as though to defy the darkness with a harvest that might belong to another generation. Hope, thin and fragile, flickered like a candle in a draught, always at risk of being snuffed but never fully extinguished. The plague was not only a matter of flesh but of soul. Faith itself was tested upon the rack. Some cried that God had abandoned mankind. Others shouted louder that this was his most terrible judgment, proof of his wrath upon a sinful people. Flagellants marched barefoot through the towns, scourging themselves until their backs ran with blood, believing that their pain might appease the Almighty. In the echo of their chants and cries, villages quaked with dread, torn between awe and despair. Was this salvation, or madness clothed in piety? And yet, amid the cries of penitence, and the smoke of burning flesh, questions lingered that none could answer. Why did the just fall alongside the wicked? Why did infants, innocent as spring lambs, perish in their cradles while corrupt men yet drew breath? Why did death walk so freely where once angels were said to guard? The silence of heaven was more terrible than the screams of the dying. For silence speaks of absence, and absence was the most unbearable wound of all. But the plague was not content with villages alone. It spread to cities, crawling up cobbled streets and through market squares, scaling the walls of castles and monasteries alike. No rank, no wealth, no crown stood as shield. Kings and queens, bishops and beggars, all breathed the same poisoned air. And so the order of the world began to fracture. Who would obey a lord if death made him no different than a peasant? Who would tie to a church whose priests fell like leaves in autumn? What use were walls, what use were swords, when the enemy was not of flesh and bone but of breath and shadow? The chronicles tell of entire towns left empty, their doors swinging on broken hinges, their hearts cold, their fields wild. Wolves padded through deserted streets. Ivy climbed the stones of abbeys where once hymns had filled the air. To walk through such a place was to walk through a graveyard without markers, where the silence itself was the epitaph. And yet, even then, the sickness spread onward, as if the emptiness were not enough, as if death itself were still hungry. Still, history is not only ruin. Even in the darkest hours, there are moments when the human spirit flares, if only for a breath. A brother carrying his sibling across a city street, refusing to let him die alone. A midwife who dared deliver a child in a house marked by the plague. A gravedigger who carved a cross upon each mound though no priest was near. Small acts, forgotten by the world, but written in eternity as defiance against despair. Yet the shadow lengthened. Messina was but the beginning. From Sicily it spread to Genoa, to Venice, to Marseilles. Like ink in water, it seeped outward, darkening every shore it touched. Caravans carried it inland, ships bore it across seas. No harbor was safe, no valley beyond its reach. And always the same story repeated, the cough, the fever, the swelling, the silence. A single thread woven through countless lives, binding Europe in one vast shroud of mourning. And so the question arose, whispered in taverns, in cloisters, in courts of kings, if this is but the beginning, what will the end be? The night deepened. The torches flickered. And though none could see it, the shadow of the coming years stretched already across the continent, vast and merciless. The age of plague had begun. It began with whispers. Always whispers. They crept from mouth to ear like the creeping fog through alleys. The dead outnumber the living. The bells toll more than they rest. God has hidden his face. In Florence, once a jewel of art and trade, laughter vanished from the markets. The Arno flowed as it always had, but fewer feet crossed its bridges. The silk looms fell still, the clang of hammers muted, as if the very heart of the city had been struck. Some locked themselves in palaces of marble and gold, feasting on wine and meat, believing indulgence might stave off despair. Others stripped themselves of every comfort, joining barefoot pilgrims who wailed hymns until their throats bled. Yet death came for both, indifferent to feast or famine, prayer or pleasure. A scribe in Florence set down these words before his ink ran dry. I beheld the streets where once 100 men had passed in an hour. Now but one walks, pale as wax, eyes darting like a hunted stag. In every doorway, a body. In every house, a grave. All flee from all, and all despise all. The plague was more than disease. It was hunger made flesh. It devoured not only lungs and flesh but trust, fellowship, the fragile cords of human kinship. Neighbors no longer knocked at one another's doors. Husbands turned from wives, wives from husbands. Children were left at roadsides when their cough grew too deep. In monasteries, the cloisters grew hollow. Monks prayed alone, their voices echoing against cold stone. What was once the warmth of community became a void, a silence so vast that it gnawed at the soul like famine. The dead demanded space, but there was none left to give. Churchyards swelled like overripe fruit, and still the carts rattled through the streets, their drivers calling out in hollow tones, "Bring out your dead." When the graves filled, pits were dug. When the pits filled, fire was called upon. But even flame grew weary, for wood was scarce, and the bodies lay too many. And so the earth itself became a sepulchre, holding not only the fallen but the stench of despair. In Paris, the Seine reflected a sky heavy with smoke. Bodies floated in its current, untended, their hands drifting upward as though reaching for a heaven that had gone deaf. The university's scholars debated in hushed rooms. Was it the alignment of the planets that poisoned the air, or the corruption of the soil, or the sins of mankind rising like vapors to suffocate the world? They measured, they charted, they quarreled. But outside their chambers, mothers pressed cloths to their children's brows, praying not for explanations but for breath that would last the night. No city was spared. Marseilles wailed. Venice choked. London braced. Everywhere the pattern repeated, at dawn a cough, at dusk a fever, by nightfall a death. And always silence after. Yet there were those who defied it, not with cure, but with memory. Priests who walked the charnel houses with trembling hands, scribes who dipped their quills though their families lay cold beside them, voices who refused to let the story vanish into dust. They recorded not only numbers but names, fragments of prayer, the brief flare of humanity before the dark. They knew that even if their ink dried in mid-stroke, the parchment might carry forward what flesh could not. But to live through it was to feel the end of all order. Kings sat uneasy on their thrones. If death spared no crown, what authority did any man hold? Soldiers deserted their posts, for what use were walls when the enemy walked in air? The church, once the fortress of hope, trembled, its authority corroded with each unanswered prayer, each priest's corpse laid at the altar. The people asked, not with reverence but with rage, if this is God's justice, then what justice is this? And in their rage, suspicion festered. Fingers pointed to the Jews, accused of poisoning wells. Pogroms erupted like wildfires, villages set upon by mobs desperate to find an enemy they could strike with steel, since death itself slipped always beyond their grasp. Entire communities were slaughtered, not by the plague, but by fear sharpened into hatred. The plague claimed their bodies, man's cruelty claimed their souls. Still, beyond the hatred and ruin, there flickered the fragile persistence of life. In the vineyards of Burgundy, a lone vintner pressed grapes though his sons lay in shallow graves. In a convent in Cologne, nuns sang hymns in trembling harmony, their voices faint but resolute, a thread of light through smothering dark. In England's green fields, a shepherd led his sheep to pasture, eyes hollow, but still his flock followed, still grass bent under hooves, still the sun set and rose again. Yet every dawn carried a question: who will see the next? The plague walked with the caravans across Europe's veins. It followed the trade roads, climbed the rivers, slipped over mountains. And with every step, silence deepened. Fields lay untilled. Halls fell empty. Bells tolled not for celebration but for warning, for farewell. A continent that had known famine, war, and sorrow now faced an enemy that devoured not just flesh, but the very hope of tomorrow. Still, history remembers not only the falling, but the standing. And though the silence grew vast, there were voices, thin, trembling, yet unbroken, that refused to let the world slip into nothingness. For even in death's dominion, the human spirit sought meaning. And meaning is what carried them into the next night. It is said that power makes a man untouchable, that crowns glint brighter than the sickle of death. But the plague cared nothing for such illusions. It strode past velvet curtains and iron gates, through palaces and cathedrals. With the same certainty it claimed the huts of peasants. In Avignon, where the papal court had made its seat, the bells of Saint Pierre rang without pause. The Holy Father himself, Pope Clement VI, was hemmed round by the smoke of burning fires. Not for warmth, but for fear. It was believed that fire might cleanse the air, might drive back the poison miasma that carried death. And so the pontiff, vicar of Christ, sat cloaked not in divine light but in smoke, while outside his chamber thousands perished in the streets, begging for blessing, for absolution, for some proof that heaven had not turned its face away. Priests faltered in their duty. Many fled. Many more fell. Who could offer last rites when their own lips trembled with fever? Who could preach salvation when their own lungs rattled with the sound of drowning? Across Christendom, faith itself cracked like ice under weight. The Church, which had stood as fortress and shepherd for centuries, seemed powerless, and in its silence, the people's hearts swelled with doubt. If the shepherd dies with the flock, who then leads? Kings fared no better. In France, the royal court whispered of omens. Charles the Wise gazed from his palace windows at streets lined with carts of the dead. His counselors spoke of fortifications, of armies, of order. But what good was steel against shadow? Against a cough, a breath, a kiss? Even knights, proud in mail and crest, fell in days. And so the court, once brimming with pomp, grew hushed, its lords clutching relics, its ladies clutching their children. The silks of the hall seemed no different than rags when death wore no crown of its own. In England, Edward III issued proclamations, commanding that the sick be buried swiftly, that order be maintained. Yet even the king's words, heavy with sovereign weight, could not command the pestilence to halt. His daughter, Joan, bound for marriage in Castile, was carried away by the plague before vows could be spoken. The grief of a king is rarely shown, but behind closed doors, it is said Edward wept, not as monarch, but as father. The chroniclers note the tremor in his reign, the way his letters grew sharper, his edicts more desperate. Even majesty was brought low by the same shadow that fell upon shepherds and masons. And in every kingdom, the machinery of power groaned. Tax collectors found no households left to tithe. Armies dwindled as soldiers deserted, fleeing to countryside or cloister. For what cause was worth dying when death was everywhere? Judges sat in empty courts, their benches lined with dust, for litigants lay buried, their disputes dissolved in silence. The very skeleton of order trembled, joints loosened, sinews frayed. The world that had seemed so eternal, crowned kings, gilded altars, laws etched in parchment, revealed itself fragile, mortal, like the bodies it claimed to govern. Yet not all bent in sorrow. Some seized the void. Nobles who survived found their coffers swollen, for lands fell vacant, heirs vanished, titles extinguished. Where once a dozen families held sway, now 2 or 3 remained, their power vast as the famine of voices around them. In towns, merchants who lived rose upon the ruin of their rivals, their wares fetching gold from desperate hands. Even the grave gave profit, for gravediggers, scarce and weary, demanded coin no man would once have offered for such grim labor. In death's court, some crowned themselves anew. But with every rise came suspicion. Why did some survive while others fell? Whispers claimed sorcery, pact, or devil's blessing. Men who prospered amid ruin were eyed as jackals fattening on the carcass of Christendom. In this climate, trust corroded faster than bodies in the pit. And power itself, once gilded by divine sanction, now appeared as carrion, contested by vultures who circled endlessly overhead. The plague also tested the faith of kings in their God. When prayers failed, when pilgrimages yielded no cure, when even the bones of saints gave no protection, a terrible doubt gnawed at the thrones of Europe. Had heaven abandoned them? Were kings truly chosen of God if they perished like commoners? The coronation oaths, the anointing oils, the solemn chants, all seemed pale against the black tide. And in their doubt, rulers grew harsh. Edicts sharpened, punishments fell swift, as though by sheer force they might bind the fraying world. Yet the rope only unraveled further. In monasteries, abbots watched their brothers fall until silence reigned in cloister and refectory alike. In universities, scholars argued until plague silenced them all. In castles, lords retreated behind walls, only to find the enemy already within. The disease spared no fortress. It asked no permission of gates. A German chronicler writes of a fortress where a noble lord withdrew with 100 retainers. They brought stores of grain, wine, salted meat, confident they could outlast the storm. Weeks passed. Then a cough echoed in the hall. Within days, the fortress was silent. When peasants at last broke down its gates, they found a feast rotting on tables, goblets spilled, chairs empty, bodies slumped like forgotten dolls. Even stone walls proved no bulwark against breath. Yet the collapse of order birthed something new. With priests fallen, some lay folk rose to lead prayers. With lords dead, peasants tilled lands for themselves. With guilds emptied, apprentices took mastery. Out of ashes, fragile sprouts of change unfurled, not by plan, but by the blind hand of necessity. And though kings and bishops clawed to restore the old order, the seeds of a new age had already been sown, watered in grief and shadow. Still, for those who lived through it, the weight was not of future history but of present despair. Thrones of ash. Altars silent. Crowns that gleamed in the firelight of burning pyres. This was their world. A world where power itself seemed a lie, stripped bare by the pestilence that spared none. And yet, even here, the question lingered, whispered like a draught through a shuttered hall. If kings could not save their people, if priests could not save their flock, who, or what, would rise to lead mankind through the shadow? The answer had not yet come. But the silence deepened, and in that silence, something was stirring. The pestilence had come as a thief in the night, but what it left behind was stranger still, not only empty houses and charnel pits, but a world unmoored, its ancient structures cracked like glass beneath a hammer. For centuries, the order of Christendom had seemed eternal. Kings upon their thrones, lords upon their manors, peasants bound to soil, priests tending the souls of all. This was the rhythm, steady as the tolling of a bell. But the Black Death broke the bell's tongue. The sound that followed was not silence alone, but something new, discordant, unshaped. Out of ruin, change began to stir. Fields lay unplowed, villages abandoned, yet the land itself did not vanish. Wheat still bent in the wind. Orchards still bore fruit. Sheep wandered without shepherds, their bleating echoing through hollow hills. And so those who lived, few though they were, found before them the spoils of the dead. A peasant who once bent his back for a lord now stepped into an empty hall and claimed it as his own. A serf, bound by law to toil on another man's land, found his master's house shuttered, his family gone to dust, and in the absence of authority, he lifted the yoke from his neck and walked free. The old chains rusted. The old walls crumbled. What bound one man to another weakened with every death. And those who survived, hardened by sorrow, learned to claim what the dead could no longer hold. Labor itself, once cheap and endless, grew precious. Where once 10 men could be found for a field, now there was but one. And that one, if he were wise, demanded higher wages, better food, more freedom. Lords who refused found their lands untended, their barns empty, their coffers bare. They cursed the insolence of the lower orders, but curses could not bring the dead back to life. And so, grudgingly, they yielded. Coin flowed where it never had before, into the callous hands of peasants, craftsmen, laborers who once had no voice but their toil. In the towns, the guilds faltered. Masters died, their apprentices scattered. But from the ruin, survivors rose swiftly. An apprentice became master not by years of service, but by mere survival. Journeymen took seats once denied them. Trade bent, reshaped itself, and in the empty stalls of markets new faces stood, selling wares with voices stronger than their station had once allowed. The hierarchy buckled. Necessity, not birth, became the measure of worth. And with necessity came restlessness. The young, hardened by ash and silence, saw no reason to bow as their fathers had. If land could be seized, if wages could be demanded, if priests and kings proved mortal, then what else might be changed? The question took root like weed through stone, silent at first, but destined to crack the edifice of centuries. The rulers of Europe saw this with growing alarm. To lose half their subjects to plague was grief enough. To lose the obedience of the rest was terror beyond words. Edicts were passed. Wages were fixed by law. Movement was forbidden, peasants ordered to remain bound to the soil. In England, Edward III decreed the statute of labourers, demanding that no man ask higher pay than before the pestilence. But parchment and seal could not bind hunger, nor silence the new voice rising in the hearts of men. The law was mocked, defied, ignored. For when a man has seen death sweep through his village and spare him alone, he is not so easily cowed by ink. Tension simmered. Beneath the surface of grief, a new fire glowed. The lords who clutched their titles, the bishops who clung to their vestments, felt the ground shifting beneath them. No longer was obedience a given, no longer was authority unquestioned. The plague had torn the veil, and men saw clearly what had been hidden, that power was fragile, that the world could be remade. Yet change was not only in law and labor. It was in the spirit of man. Survivors bore scars not only on flesh but on soul. They had seen priests fail, kings weep, neighbors betray. They had seen walls of stone crumble, and with them, the illusion of eternity. Theirs was a generation baptized not by water, but by fire and rot. And in that baptism, something new was born, a hunger for meaning, for dignity, for a life more than survival. In France, peasants would one day rise in the Jacquerie, driven by the memory of lords who abandoned them in the plague years. In England, revolt would stir, the cry of commoners echoing against the walls of London. The plague did not birth these revolts alone, but it sowed the seed, watered with the blood of millions, tilled by the silence of empty fields. Yet in the moment, none spoke of revolutions. They spoke of wages, of fields, of how to bury the dead when the earth itself seemed weary of opening. But beneath those words lay the whisper of a storm to come. And still, through all, the plague lingered. Change was born not in the peace after, but in the shadow during. Every bargain, every demand, every theft of land or coin was made under the toll of bells, under the smoke of burning pits. It was as though death itself, unknowing, had become midwife to a new world. A monk in Cologne, weary with burial, wrote these words before his hands stiffened with fever: "The pestilence kills many, but not all. Those who live seem changed. They are bolder, sharper, less bound by fear of man or God. Perhaps the Lord in his wrath has not destroyed the world, but forged it anew. If so, what will it become?" The ink dried. His hands stilled. But the question remained. And the world, still trembling in shadow, had only begun to answer. The chronicles of kings and priests tell of decrees, battles, and councils, but the true weight of the plague was born in the kitchens and cottages of the nameless. It was there, in the damp corners of villages, in the narrow alleys of towns, that humanity clung like a flame struggling against the wind. A woman in Siena, whose name the parchment never kept, carried her 3 children through the streets when fever took her husband. She laid him upon the steps of a church already crowded with corpses, whispering to the stone saints, "Guard him." Her children asked when their father would wake, but her only answer was silence, for her throat ached with a truth she could not bear to speak. That night she pressed them to her breast, though her own skin burned with fever, unwilling to let them die alone. In the morning, her neighbors found the door barred from within. None opened it again. In a small hamlet beyond Cologne, a shepherd returned from pasture to find his village hollow, doors ajar, fires cold, tables set with rotting bread. The silence pressed upon him like a hand upon the chest. He called out names, his brother, his cousins, his mother, but no answer came. Only the bleating of sheep, confused and restless, as though they too sensed the absence. He led his flock into the fields and never returned, wandering from hill to hill, a living ghost herding shadows. These were not stories written in chronicles, but they lived in the marrow of those who endured. For every carload of bodies, there was a hand that lifted, a tear that fell, a heart that broke in silence. Communities struggled to hold themselves together, though the very glue of trust seemed dissolved. Some towns barred their gates, setting guards to drive away travelers, fearing strangers more than hunger. In others, neighbors cared for one another, risking death to bring bread, to draw water, to whisper prayers over the sick. Both choices bore a cost. Isolation bred famine, compassion bred contagion. There was no path without sorrow. And yet, even amidst despair, the need for ritual endured. Graves grew shallow, priests scarce, but families still carved crosses into wood, still laid flowers upon earth. Children drew crude signs of angels upon walls with charcoal, hoping their hands might call heaven's gaze. Women lit candles before images of the Virgin, though wax was dear, believing the flame might guide lost souls through darkness. Humanity refused to surrender its dead to mere silence. Even if heaven seemed deaf, the living would speak for those who could no longer. But there were nights when silence triumphed. When a cottage went dark, no smoke from its hearth, no voice from its door, and no one dared to enter. The living passed quickly, eyes averted, as though the house itself had become a tomb. In time, ivy swallowed the walls, roofs caved, and the memory of those within dissolved like ash in the rain. Survival demanded choices. A farmer in Burgundy abandoned his fields to flee into the hills with his kin, believing the air of the valleys poisoned. They built a crude shelter of branches, living on roots and berries, watching from afar as their village smoke thinned and vanished. They returned months later to find weeds high as their waists, homes hollow, the church door swinging wide. They set to work again, planting, building, yet they spoke little, as if their tongues themselves feared to stir the silence. Elsewhere, survival meant cruelty. In a fishing village along the coast of Normandy, a ship returned with sailors coughing blood. The townsfolk, wild with terror, barred the harbor with fire. The vessel drifted, its crew begging for aid, until their cries grew faint and the tide carried them out. The sea claimed them, but the village endured. To save oneself, others had to be condemned. Such was the arithmetic of despair. And still, children were born. Their first cries rose in the midst of mourning, frail yet defiant. Mothers pressed them to fevered breasts, whispering promises that they might never keep. You will live. You must live. The world seemed barren of hope, yet life pushed upward like grass between stones, relentless, unbidden. To see an infant draw a breath when so many had lost it was to glimpse a miracle, however fleeting. These small acts, a loaf baked, a child born, a field sown, were the rebellion of the living against the dominion of death. They were not recorded in chronicles. They left no dates, no banners, no seals. But they were the truest chronicles of the plague years, etched not in parchment, but in flesh and memory. And yet, survivors bore more than wounds of flesh. They carried guilt heavier than any chain. Why had they been spared when fathers, sisters, children lay in pits? Many whispered that they lived not by chance but by curse, chosen to walk amidst ghosts. Some broke beneath the weight, wandering mad through fields, crying names into empty air. Others clung fiercely to their survival, hoarding food, grasping land, clutching at life with both hands as though death might yet return to claim the debt. The burden of survival was this: to live on in a world where nothing familiar remained. To eat bread at a table once full, now empty. To walk streets where laughter had rung, now silent. To rise each morning asking not what will I do, but who will remain? And yet they endured. For endurance was itself the only answer they could give. The dead had scarcely settled into earth before the pestilence returned. Those who had survived the first wave thought the trial over, that death's hunger was at last sated. But the plague was not a storm that passed. It was a tide, retreating only to surge again, blacker, higher, crueler. In the streets of Florence, children who had once buried parents now buried siblings, and soon enough, no hand remained to bury them. Grass grew in the piazzas, goats wandered through the markets where silks once shone. A city of poets, merchants, and bankers became a city of whispers and ashes. Survivors muttered, "It cannot come again," and yet it came, knocking with the same iron hand. In England, where bells had tolled until ropes frayed, the returning plague found villages already thinned. Crops lay uncut, fields wild, cottages crumbling. Rats nested in empty cradles. When the sickness came again, it needed fewer days to conquer, for there were fewer hearts left to resist. Chroniclers wrote not of battles or kings, but of second visitations, waves upon waves, until men ceased to count them and spoke instead of the years of death. For the pestilence did not strike once and vanish, it stalked generations. Every few years it flared again, like embers stirred to flame. A child born in 1350 could live to see plague return in 1361, 1369, 1375, and beyond. Whole lifetimes were braided with the black thread. The very air of Europe seemed woven with death's breath. The horror of repetition carved deeper wounds than the first terror. The first visitation had come like thunder, swift and merciless. But the second, the third, the fourth, these seeped into bones like a damp that never dried. Hope itself grew brittle. Why rebuild, why sow, why marry, when death would return as surely as winter? Faith too bent beneath the weight. Priests who had promised that the first scourge was God's punishment could find no words when it returned. Was heaven's wrath unending? Had Christ turned his face away forever? Some clung to piety with desperate fervor, flagellants still scourging themselves bloody in public squares, crying that only suffering could appease divine fury. Others abandoned the churches, muttering that prayers were hollow against the pestilence's hunger. In taverns and ruined streets alike, voices whispered, "Perhaps God is gone." But not only God was doubted. Humanity itself seemed suspect. Trust dissolved. Travelers were hunted from villages, strangers beaten back with stones. Rumors of poison spread again, and those marked as different, Jews, lepers, foreigners, bore the weight of suspicion. Pogroms flared like wildfires, torching lives already fragile, as if slaughtering the innocent might appease the unseen hand. And yet the plague was blind to hatred. It struck persecutor and persecuted alike. Fires of rage could not drive it out. In time, even violence grew weary, as though men had spent their strength in vain. The years blurred. In France, peasants told children not tales of heroes but tales of survival. How their kin had hidden in forests, how they had dug shallow wells when rivers were fouled with corpses. In the German states, travelers spoke of abandoned castles where owls nested in the rafters and weeds grew in the banquet halls. In Italy, villages shrank into fortified cores, walls not to repel armies but the breath of sickness itself. And always the silence returned. Silence deeper than war, deeper than famine, for it was the silence of absence, of voices never to be heard again. Survivors began to carry death within them, even when plague spared their bodies. Faces grew gaunt not only from hunger but from despair. Children who had grown up amidst funerals played at burying dolls, their games shadows of graves. Lovers wedded with more fear than joy, as though binding themselves not for life but for mourning yet to come. This was the true mark of the years of death, not only the heaping of bodies, but the erosion of the human spirit. To live under the certainty that plague would return was to live half-buried already. Yet even so, life clung. Markets reopened, though smaller. Bells tolled again for marriages as well as funerals. Songs were sung, darker songs, songs of death and love entwined, but songs nonetheless. Humanity would not vanish, though it staggered. But in the deep night, when winds howled through broken shutters, survivors lay awake with one question gnawing them: when will it come again? And always the answer was the same: soon. The pestilence did not vanish. It never truly did. It receded like a sea that had drowned a land, leaving wreckage and silence in its wake. But in that silence, faintly, life stirred. The years of death had scoured Europe raw, stripping away half her people, emptying towns, silencing monasteries, felling kings and peasants alike. Yet from the wounds, new shoots pushed through. Humanity, like grass after fire, bent low but rose again. Not with triumph, but with weary determination. Across the fields of England, Where weeds had claimed abandoned farms, survivors took plow to soil once more. Land lay open, vast and ownerless, for so many lords had died that boundaries blurred. Laborers, once bound by feudal chains, discovered a new truth: their hands were needed. With fields empty and barns silent, the price of toil rose. Men and women who had been little more than serfs demanded wages, demanded freedom, demanded to be heard. The plague had slain not only people but the old order itself. Kings and nobles resisted, but the ground had shifted. In 1381, the English peasants rose in fury, shouting that they would no longer bow. Though crushed, their voices rang through centuries, the echo of a world beginning to turn. For the pestilence had broken more than bodies, it had broken the foundations of power. In the cities, silence gave way to industry. Florence, Venice, Paris, London, their streets had been graveyards, but commerce returned. Merchants once ruined found new fortunes, inheriting the wealth of dead kin or seizing opportunities in the vacuum. Gold shifted hands, guilds grew, and new families rose where old dynasties had ended. The very face of society was remade, as though death itself had rearranged the chessboard. Faith, too, bore its scars. The Church, once unquestioned, had faltered in the years of plague, its prayers unanswered, its priests often the first to flee. Many still clung to the cross, but others turned their eyes elsewhere. Mystics and heretics multiplied, each claiming new visions of truth. Pilgrims walked strange roads, seeking shrines that promised miracles. In the cracks of old faith, seeds of reform were sown. Yet even as faith wavered, art bloomed in new and haunting forms. Painters covered walls with visions of skeletal dancers leading kings and peasants hand in hand, the danse macabre, a reminder that death spared none. Poets wrote of fleeting love, of life's fragility, of roses that wither in a breath. Music softened, mournful and tender, as though every note remembered the silence it rose against. Out of suffering, beauty was born, beauty shaped by shadow. For ordinary folk, life was lived more fiercely. Weddings were celebrated with wild abandon, feasts lasted deep into night, wine was drunk as though tomorrow would never come. The memory of plague gave urgency to joy. Children were cherished, songs were louder, love more desperate, as if each day must stand against the certainty of loss. And in this way, humanity turned, not away from death, for death had become a companion, but toward life despite it. The slow shift had begun. The years of death left their mark on every soul, but the survivors learned that even beneath plague's shadow, bread must be baked, fields must be sown, bells must ring. The world that emerged was not the same world that had entered the pestilence. It was leaner, harsher, but also freer. From ruin came change. From silence, a new song. And though the memory of the plague never faded, though its shadow stretched long across generations, mankind walked forward. Not triumphant, not unscarred, but alive. The bells have fallen silent. The graves are grown over. The voices that once wept are long gone, their echoes faded into earth. Yet still, the Black Death walks with us. Not in flesh, not in fever, but in shadow. For what is history, if not memory carved deep into the bones of a people? And what memory is greater than the years when half the world seemed to vanish, when every dawn might be one's last, when even the air was heavy with dread? The plague ended, yes. The carts no longer creak through city streets, no longer bear their grim cargo of the nameless dead. But the wound it carved never healed. It shaped the way men pray, the way women love, the way children laugh. It shaped kingdoms and churches, markets and fields. It reshaped time itself, for those who lived through it marked their lives not by years or reigns, but by before the pestilence and after it. It taught us that life is not certain, that power is not eternal, that no throne, no altar, no house of stone can stand against the whisper of sickness carried by the breath. It humbled kings, and it lifted peasants. It tore the world apart, and, in tearing, forced it into something new. The Renaissance, that flowering of art and thought, rose from soil watered with death. Revolutions in labor, in freedom, in faith itself were born in the void plague had left behind. Even the very hunger for knowledge, for medicine, for understanding of the body and the stars was sharpened by those years of helplessness. The plague was a wound, but from the wound came vision. And yet, let us not gild the horror. For every birth of beauty, there was a thousandfold cry of loss. Entire families erased, villages that never returned, languages and songs swallowed into silence. What was lost cannot be measured in numbers, only in absence. In empty chairs, in nameless graves, in lullabies no longer sung. Still, across centuries, the Black Death whispers. We feel it in every fear of pestilence, in every rumor of contagion, in every mask raised against unseen air. It taught humanity to live with the unseen, to dread what cannot be grasped, to sense death in the very breath we draw. Its shadow remains, not as terror only, but as reminder. A reminder that life is fragile. A reminder that death is certain. A reminder that even in the deepest night, men and women will still light candles, still sing, still cling to one another, still bury their dead with trembling hands and rise again the next morning to till the earth, to laugh, to hope. That is the legacy of the Black Death. Not only the graves, not only the despair, but the endurance. A species brought low, yet not undone. A song broken by silence, yet not extinguished. And so, centuries later, as we look back, we see not merely a chronicle of death, but of survival. A world remade by horror, but still a world. And we, their heirs, carry the shadow with us. The shadow, and the light that burned against it. The Black Death is gone. But its lesson endures.